Hello and welcome to the webinar, Understanding Transracial Factors. My name is Courtney Williams, the host of America's Kids Belong's FosterCon webinar series. We are in the middle of our Understanding series, a series on understanding various things needed to be a great foster family. And we hope that if you've already watched one or two or three of these, that you're just getting a lot out of this series and that you continue to watch them as we produce more. I am a foster and adoptive mom. I have four children through adoption who are Black. As a white mom, I have two Hispanic kids. And so this is a topic near and dear to my heart. Just knowing and understanding that our family has got it wrong so many times, but knowing that there's grace for that, but also knowing that we can learn from our mistakes. We can learn our adult kids who are adopted kids. They have taught us a lot and shared with us some of their feelings and thoughts about growing up in our home, as well as our guests today. So today we have with us Isaac Eder. He will be who you're hearing from the most. Almost an hour worth of this webinar is from our interview with Isaac Eder. He's a transracial adoptee, and he now does trainings and such with his mom. And it's a true pleasure to hear Isaac speak. Whenever he speaks, he just speaks from experience. He speaks from his heart and just gives a lot of great insights into how we can do this better with transracial placements, whether that's foster care or adoption. And then we're going to hear a shorter little part of an interview with Greg and Sam Holback. And if you listen to that, want to hear the whole thing, it's from one of our podcast episodes. You can go back and find that in the Foster Friendly podcast. But Greg and Sam, they adopted two Lakota girls, which is a Native American tribe, which that's pretty uncommon. It's not very common for that to happen. Not suggesting that you watch this with the thought or hope that that's going to happen to you, but I just love their story and the things that they did to really bring the culture into their home and teach that the community to teach their girls about their culture. So, whether it's Native American or Black or Hispanic or white and whatever it might be for you, transracial placements, I hope you get a lot of all these conversations and just see how they're doing things really well. The Holbacks in their home, and then Isaac just sharing of his experience and how we can do things better. And like I said, even then he feels like his birth parents or his adoptive parents did, but now goes around and trains with his mom. He's got a great relationship with her and has come full circle in that situation as well. So it's just a beautiful thing to be able to share these stories with you. Isaac is a transracial adoptee. He's also a social entrepreneur, reshaping how we support adoptive families. He was adopted at age 2, and he brings both lived experience and professional expertise to his work as the founder of Identity and Parenting Different. He's a sought-after speaker and educator and sparks honest conversations about how to support adopted children while they grow up. He also equips parents and child welfare professionals with the tools and understanding needed to build homes where adoptees feel seen, heard, and truly valued. I love that. Aligns with our mission very much. So again, thanks for being here today, Isaac.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you on. And yeah, so before we get more into this conversation around transracial adoption and all the things in that space, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your own story?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as kind of already mentioned, I am an adoptee and I'm a transracial adoptee as well. I was adopted when I was 2. And I think that my experience, like many adoptees who were adopted when I was adopted, was full of a lot of love and a lot of support and all those things. But the conversation or the knowledge around how to navigate interracial placements, interracial adoption, didn't exist. And so it wasn't a conversation or topic or truly recognized throughout my upbringing. And so, well, you might say like transracial adoption, that's a little bit hard. Well, I think that how race got mentioned was more trying to make sense of why there was one Black kid in an all white family, right? And so that was the most of the dialogue around race. And so we never had any other conversations about what that might mean or how I even maybe felt about that. And so race was not a topic, though adoption was a topic. So my parents were really great about talking about adoption. I struggled from a very early age to understand adoption, to understand why I was placed for adoption. And I think those elements of grief and loss showed up very early for me. And I had to navigate them and struggle with feelings of abandonment and rejection from the time I was like 6. And so it started that early for me. And I think the more and more we learn about adoptees and how they start to think about adoption and about their kind of psychology, is we learn that usually these things actually start around that time point. They're not starting, I think a lot of us want to believe they're going to start later. But we are seeing more and more kids who are in that kind of kindergarten, first grade time period, starting to wrestle with ideas of adoption and curiosity and wondering. And so that's when it started for me. And race didn't really become a factor until I was a little bit older. And my initial feelings around race were not about any kind of like political or like social issue, right? They were all about wanting to fit in, not feeling different, not feeling ashamed for not looking like my family or not looking like everybody else in our community. I grew up around three other adoptees that were Black, and it was just, it was just us. There wasn't anybody else. And so we were figuring it out together. And it wasn't until I was almost going to college that I came across a lot of racial stuff online that was more about racial injustice, racism, bias. And that's when I started to just get an idea that there might be more to my experience than just feeling different or feeling weird for looking different. That's when I started to get an idea that maybe I would experience something different than my white peers. And as soon as I went to college, I was hit with that reality. I was hit with bias. I was hit with racism. I was hit with also like confusing things like white peers in my dorm wanting to call me the N-word, like wanting to say that casually. And as a transracial adoptee who was obviously not super aware of a lot of things, not knowing how to navigate that, right? Not knowing how to make sense of it either. Uh, and so this led to me ultimately bringing up race and my family at first not really understanding. I ended up moving away, ended up dropping out of college and moving to Atlanta to try and go on my own kind of racial identity journey. And what a better place than Atlanta, right? And so I went on this journey to find myself and find myself in the Black community. And during that time, I got a lot of self-confidence, a lot of racial confidence as well, just understanding where I fit into being a Black person. And while I was doing that, I was 18, 19 at the time. My parents were going through their own journey. My parents were reading things that they saw I was reading. They were meeting with the one Black professor I had at the college that I went to. They were trying to get an idea of like why couldn't they understand what I was experiencing? Why couldn't they relate? And they were going through their own educational process around what it was actually like for me as an adult of a different race, that my experience was not the same as theirs. And so when I eventually moved back to, my home area in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, I came back to different parents. I came back to parents who wanted to have conversations, who were apologetic, but who also wanted to dive deeper. And that created a really powerful moment of healing, not only for me, but for us as a family. And I also think a very big step towards attachment. For the first time, maybe feeling truly seen as more than just their adopted child, but as a Black child as well, who was going to have a different experience than them. And so that sparked a very long, like obviously healing is a lifelong journey, but that sparked a really long healing journey where a lot of conversations were able to come up onto the table. And my parents and me talked through a lot of things. And in the midst of those years of conversations, I was asked to speak at a cultural training for a local adoption agency. And I kept doing it. Like she kept asking me to come back, the social worker who asked me. And eventually she pulled me aside and said, I don't know what else you're doing, but you should just do this. And I was just I was still a kid at the time. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with my life. And that started me in the journey that I guess I've still been on now, this maybe second phase of the journey, which has been adoption education, building stuff for parents, recreating the experience that adoptees have in homes, and trying to equip parents with the knowledge, language, and tools to really support their children through each phase.
Wow.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. That was really a great, I know, trying to do a flyover of kind of your journey in adoption and, in that whole story was a great contextual flyover. Just kind of set up your story, but also kind of where you've been learning and growing and your parents. Let's go back to your parents, which you already did mention, and sort of, it sounded like college era where they really were doing their own work and sound like that was, yep, a part of some real new growth together. What else kind of, as you look back, maybe it was earlier in the childhood or would you say that you saw them do well when it came to being a transracial family? If you could look back.
Yeah, well, I think some of the things that my parents did super well was understanding that adoption was complex. And so I would say that and even they would say, because I do a lot of this work. If you've seen any of my content, I do a lot of this work with my family now. And so even they would say there's probably limited number of things that we might say just in the transracial category. But there's a lot of things we would say in the adoption category, right? And it's transracial adoption. So we'll put them together for this. And my parents were always very good at understanding that adoption was complex, that it was full of grief, that it was full of loss. And because of that, when I struggled early, it wasn't like taboo to mention adoption. It wasn't taboo to mention my birth mother. It wasn't taboo for these things to come up. Not to mention I was adopted when I was 2, so I lived with my birth mother for those first 2 years. So it wasn't like I was in foster care for those 2 years. And so I did have a little bit of a different story, which I think added to their understanding that it might be more complex for me. So I would say that they did a really great job of recognizing that adoption was more than how they built a family. It was more than just me joining their family. It was going to include these other elements for me. And I was going to have to navigate those. And they were good about doing what I would consider their best at helping me navigate that with the tools that they had, with the knowledge that they had. And, we all know that adoption education has not been like the most robust part of the adoption world historically. And so they were also dealing with less information, much less information than parents are having today. I mean, you can go on Instagram now and find a wide array of opinions and education, but you can also just find a lot, right? And so whether it's all good or bad is beside the point. You'll find a lot. And that didn't exist when I was growing up, right? And so my parents, I think, did a really good job for what they did know, what they did learn from the adoption agency I was adopted through, and the adoption agency my brother, 10 years after me, was adopted through. They did do a really good job of recognizing the complexity of adoption. And then as we kind of think about some elements of transracial adoption, my parents do talk about ways in which they recognize me being treated differently because of my race, like, hair policies that I was told they were told that I had to follow, but other white peers did not have to, and how they had to advocate for that. And one of the elements that I think comes up in that is that they often advocated for me, but I didn't understand what was happening. And so, or I didn't know about it at all. And so, in one sense, great, because parents protecting great things, but it also left me without language or a framework of why it might be wrong that the choir director wanted me to cut my hair, but the other kid could have an afro, right? And so I think there was a lot of things that were maybe half good, right? And that's, I think, just again, due to, especially in transracial adoption, the limited knowledge on how to really cross that bridge, how to have that conversation with your child.
Yeah,
Makes
that's
sense.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Travis and I both are transracial adoptive parents. So I'm sure Travis is nodding along as I am of yep, we've been down this road. There are things that I know as a parent that I definitely have gotten wrong, and things I look back on, things I'm still apologizing to my kids for. And I still have some in the home who I'm still raising. And, I've learned through our kids who are now adults have been like, hey, mom and dad, these are some things that would have helped me, that we can do differently now. But so I love that. And I love to see that, you're often doing these trainings and things with your mom and getting her perspective as well. I've heard of
It's a powerful perspective.
It's just
It
great.
adds so much context.
For
Two
sure.
things. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand and study and figure out, how we can help adoptive parents understand what adoptees might be feeling and how to translate that into their parenting. But I think by me doing these trainings with my mom, it also humanizes the adoptive parent experience in a way that I can't, right? Because I don't usually get seen, even though I am a parent and I'm not an adoptive parent, but I am a parent, I usually get seen as more of an adoptee than a parent, right? And so I do love doing these trainings with my mom because I think that we work together very well to send a message that I think coming from both of us gets more well received than coming from one of us.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great. And it is good to have the bird's eye view of all the perspectives, because when we get into the lane, like one lane, it's just really hard, because it's easy to get stuck there and not to see. So
Yes, 100%.
yeah. So also, what are some things maybe now looking back that your parents could have done differently, or things that you coach families to do differently that maybe would have helped you as you were growing up?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the vein of transracial adoption, just thinking, I think a lot of times, well, let me just contextualize it with my parents first. My parents didn't have a framework for racial conversations at all, and were even advised to not talk about it, right? And so, limited context, poor advice, right? And so that was how they walked into transracial parenting, and so that was a byproduct in my upbringing. My upbringing voided that being a topic, and the goal was to try and make me feel just like my white siblings, just like peers in the community, and for that element of my life to ideally be as little noticed as possible. What we find through this, which is kind of like the colorblind approach that we kind of all recognize now is not the best way to approach racial conversations, is that when you do that, you tend to leave your child to navigate it on their own. So instead of them not navigating it, they navigate it on their own, which is usually not what we want. Or I think it's never what we want, to be honest. It's never what we want. We don't want our kids to try and wrestle with complex things on their own, especially as children. And that was my experience. I learned a lot of stuff about race from the internet, which was probably not the place that I should have learned it, right? I was reading very extreme statements on the internet as a young teenager, and that was becoming the context for how I was learning about race in America. And that is not the context in which we would want our children to learn about race in America. We would want to learn about it in a framework that is the truth and that sets them up for success, but does not, polarize them. And when we think about the internet in general nowadays, that is how the internet is. The internet it goes to its sides. And I think one thing that I talk to parents very often about is thinking about conversations about race as an ongoing thing.
Mhm.
And to reframe how you might think about talking about race. So in the book that I wrote, one of the last chapters is a framework of the best things to do at each age group. And so it goes 0 to 5, 5 to 12, 12 to 18, and 18 and beyond. And in 0 to 5, what we advise is just like normalizing and embracing like their differences. So it's like the kids' books you have, the TV shows they watch, the art in your home, right? Or the art in their room. But then it's also how you talk about taking care of their skin and their hair. And a lot of people don't view that as a race conversation because we're just thinking about conversations about race within the framework of like bias, racism, like heaviness. But that is not the encompassing of race, right? The race part of my life is not just that side of it. It is also like learning to take care of my hair and learning to take care of my skin, which was different than my parents. And so during these 0 to 5 years, even though in your mind it might not be having a conversation about race, it really is, because it's a conversation about self-worth, self-beauty, and caring about themselves. And then when you see them walk into this next stage where they're going to school, having friends, and their own curiosity is going to come up, this is where we can, I think, introduce small ways of talking about difference, especially when it comes up when kids ask them why their parents are white, right?
Yeah.
There's a transracial adoptee question. You're going to get this one if you're a transracial adoptee, right? And this becomes a beautiful moment to talk about race in a very simple context, right? Which is that some people look different than others. And because of that, we have different cultures and different things. And again, it's not a heavy conversation about like racism and bias. It's just a conversation about race being a factor in life. And it acknowledges, you recognize that is their experience.
Hmm.
And then as you start to get into more complex things, you can start to weave in these ideas that some people have biases. Some people have biases and you don't agree with those biases, but they're going to happen. And when you slowly start to introduce these ideas and have conversations that are more simplistic rather than like heavy all the time, I think you create a lot of safety around talking about race, which is something that all transracial adoptees are thinking about to one degree or another. And it also takes the pressure off of you to like have like one big talk that answers all the questions. I jokingly say that like a lot of adoptive parents, transracial adoptive parents, think about talking about race like they think about the talk. And so like they think You know what I mean? They think they're gonna have like this, like it's gonna come to a head, and there's gonna be one big moment where their curiosity finally peaked, and you can't avoid it anymore. And it's gonna be like this one big thing that answers all their questions. But it's just really not like that, right? It's an ongoing part of their journey, and the information that children need about race changes as they get older. When your kids are teenagers and they're spending time with their friends and alone, they need to be mindful about different things than they did at 5.
Mhm.
And so it's really thinking about this as a continual conversation and not always a heavy one, not always about, the heaviness, but also about the beauty of race and culture.
That's
Yeah.
great. Yeah, I love how you break it down to different stages and ages as well, because I do know, I mean, just in research I've done in both trauma and in race, there's different stages where kids think about things or things are brought up, when they first go to school and then they turn 9 and they start to have more questions about the identity and then
That's a big one.
16 and 18, it's like all those different ages where we need to be prepared. And we need to be willing to have those conversations and start, like you said, at a young age. And, I know people who have held the fact, obviously not transracial, but held the fact that their children were adopted until the kids were a lot older. And, I think that used to be pretty common. And I think we've seen how much hurt that caused for adoptees in the past. And I think it's the same thing when it comes to race or it comes to anything else. When we hold back those conversations, it causes more pain in the future.
Fires.
Absolutely. Yeah, our goal is connection, right? In adoption, there's we're constantly talking about attachment and bonding. And to me, this is like a part of that. Like this is
Mhm.
you wanna build attachment and bonding with your child. This is a part of that when it's transracial adoption, because this is the seen and seen heard value. I mean, there's a lot of ways that we could take the seen, but one of the ways we would interpret the seen and seen heard valued is seeing them as their full self. And in the case of transracial adoptees, that includes their racial identity.
Right.
Yeah. So shifting gears a little bit, when you talked about the transracial through the years, for your own journey and story, grief is in adoption is real. It's part of the journey of adoption, right? It's something parents need to, same thing, have conversations early on, recognize it, talk about it. What are some things in different stages of your life that you experience the grief side of adoption?
Yeah, great question. Well, yeah, grief is such an interesting part of adoption because it shows up so differently in different seasons. And as a child, I think it showed up through depression and anxiety things, especially in those elementary years. I mean, of course, it showed up behaviorally, and this is probably one of the most common ways grief and loss is showing up in adoption is through behavior, right?
Mhm.
And this is one of the reasons I love things like TBRI and things that help us reframe behavior in kids that have experienced trauma, because behavior is a symptom, right? It's a symptom of something. And that was certainly true for me. It's not like I was the craziest, worst kid, but I definitely struggled and was rebellious. And I think a lot of that was due to having complicated feelings about adoption, but as a byproduct of having complicated feelings about adoption, having complicated feelings about myself and my own self-worth and what adoption meant about me. And that made me, experience like really heavy feelings of grief around it. And then as I transitioned into adulthood, I think grief got connected with a lot of moments that like just didn't exist or may never exist.
Mhm.
I'm a parent now. I've had a biological child, and my birth mom wasn't there. My birth father wasn't there, right? And so grief translates now into different things and into big transitions. When I go through big transitions, it shows up there. When I accomplish things, it shows up there, and it's not like paralyzing, right? It's not like it's like all I can think about, but I do think that grief is interesting, at least adoption grief is interesting in that way, in which it tends to find you at these turning points in life. And yeah, I don't know many adoptees who that isn't when it shows up.
Hmm.
I'm sure there are some that maybe never think about it, but I know many adoptees who, at least to some degree or another, at the big transitions in life, it also spurs curiosity, wondering about what their birth parents are doing, because you got to think about it, your wedding, birth of a child, graduations,
Hmm.
first jobs, promotions, all these things that you share with people close to you, like your family and like your parents, they do almost remind you of who you're not sharing it with. And I think that's a very realistic way that grief shows up for not just me, but for many adoptees.
That's really real and honest. What I really love too about that for people that aren't adopted, or especially that aren't in a transracial adoption situation themselves, being that child, that's really, that helps anyone kind of feel what that might feel a little bit like, in that, because we've all faced loss. So, I lost my dad 3 years ago. And so to your parallel of looking at those major event points and going, what would it have been like if dad was here? But for you, I mean, it is a severing of that biological parent that so in that way, it is that parallel same type of a grief then, with that
100%.
person that's not there. So
Yes.
that was really powerful how you said that. Switching gears again in this conversation, this is a fascinating part. We're going to talk some about comparative differences in culture, because obviously your lens of being, an African-American guy in a predominantly white family and white context, and a lot, it sounds like, growing up. I'm laughing too thinking about this because my wife and I go to almost a half and half African-American and white church, and it's been amazing and really fun. Also to have those types of conversations where I'm still learning a ton, even recently, of where I realized how white potlucks are. So when we have like that, that's like, my black friends like, man, I love you, dude, but I ain't eating your food. I don't know who made that. And so, but even those conversations of like, no cookouts, and this is why we do that. And, so anyway, if walk us through just some of your experiences of just what you've seen culturally different beyond just some of the obvious things that we can think about with hair and food and things like that, but just in the white and black communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think some things you might think about culturally is confidence in identity is a big one. So also, um, this might, maybe this is not the best way to say it, but like uniformity. Whereas like same conversations happening in black homes here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania are probably happening in your city. And so it's like, I think that's a very interesting cultural difference. And I don't think you just find that between black and white communities, but all communities of color and then all white communities. I tend to find that like how my friends who grew up in those homes grew up, the normalization of like these seasonal learnings was very different. And so that would be one that I think is like really clear, how um, how it doesn't tend to distort, which I think becomes an argument in transracial adoption about how we talk about race. It doesn't tend to distort their racial identity or confuse them, but how conversations about race and behavior and how they might be perceived are normalized conversations, and conversations that wouldn't or maybe not even need to happen in many white homes. And so that's a big one. Some other ones, I think the cookout example was a really good one. I know you said outside of some of these ones, but I think
Or
that's a
inside
really,
too, but
yeah. I think another one that I think I hear a lot, and I don't want to use all the things you don't want to talk about, but I think sometimes when we think about hair stuff, we think about like just like a barber shop. But I think another part of it is some of the cultural context in the community that has existed within silos like that, within communities of color. And so it's like the barbershop might be one example, but also it also might be like the park in your community. And it might be, where certain people get their hair braided. It seems to be like there's a lot of like cultural community built that way that I found living in Atlanta. Like I found living in Atlanta a very different way of life than I grew up in, even though my upbringing had its own sense of culture, right? Like I grew up as a homeschooled black kid in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So you might not say it's like a crazy culture, but the way that I grew up had its own rhythm and routine and its own things. But I did find that when I lived in Atlanta and now having a more mix of community, the leaning on a community side, it looks very different. Another example, which I think can be really powerful just in the context of adoption, because one of the conversations that comes up a lot is around people of color adopting and fostering. And another thing that even I found from the outside living in Atlanta, but then have grown to understand even more, is the sense of community around children. And I think that's a really interesting part of communities of color, which is like obviously due to a lot of like systematic things, but the idea that a lot of foster care has existed within communities of colors, but has never been formal foster care. And I lived in a neighborhood in Atlanta. I was working with this nonprofit, and so I was intentionally living in a low-income community. And it was very interesting how normal it was for kids to stay at different homes on the block. It was very normalized. And I remember how interesting that was. You know what I mean? I would have never, like, there were kids that lived down the street. My parents would have never just dropped me off at their house.
Yeah.
So feels like there's some interesting things there that I think are cultural. And I think that you actually might even find going to a church that's half Black, like you might find yourself in the mix of that culture.
Yes, 100%. Everything you're saying, I'm like, I've now seen that lens of what you're exactly saying, of like even things around like maybe the election, maybe so many things that feel much more from what I'm seeing in their culture of community feeling, like the us language. I feel like so many of us in our white evangelical space or whatever, it's much more, and the kids coming in to a church service, much more of an awareness of like how Dre got his new haircut or what clothes he's wearing, compared to like his experience in a previous white church where it was just like, those things weren't necessarily embraced by his community of like people that he looks like, So it's been beautiful to see that. That's been very different.
Yeah, I think it's a very beautiful part of culture. And, I think it's such a benefit to transracial families to be in these settings, because I think just like how I can see how you're expressing, it's like, it's been a joy. And I think that a lot of transracial parents, at least on the front end, are nervous about these things. And maybe even scared, right? Like, stepping outside of our own lens and our own community is scary at times. And I have yet to find transracial parents who have stepped out of their community and felt like it did not have many joys. It did not have many gifts. Was it hard at times? Maybe. Was it complicated at first to explain why you're the white family at the Black church? Maybe. But I have yet to find transracial parents who have not just found endless personal joy and growth from being a part of those spaces outside of all the benefits that are going to come for their children, right? There's going to be a ton of those. We can talk about it on almost every degree, how it's much easier to navigate transracial parenting with communities that look exactly like your child. But I find that more than not, there's personal joy in embracing, even if it's going to the barbershop, just excitement that parents themselves find, which is an additional gift on top of the gift of being a parent and raising across cultures and all the gifts that come with adoption.
Yeah, it's great. Good things to talk about. Let's talk a little bit about code switching and ghost kingdoms, because I think these are very common things for transracial adoptees to experience. As I said, I'm a transracial adoptive mom of 6 kids who have been adopted. 2 of them are Hispanic, 4 are Black. So have walked this in a couple different lenses.
I was going to say, you have a fun home.
Yeah, we do. But we have a son who always tells us that his friends tease him that he's the whitest Black person they've ever met. And the first time he said this, it was kind of like this, we didn't raise you hoping that would be the outcome, right? It was like we went into this thinking, oh, we're going to raise him to be white. But it is a natural happening of being in a white home. And we do have to recognize we did raise him in a white home, like we tried to incorporate things. We talked about race. We did the things we thought we should do, but it's still, he talks like us. He dressed like us when he first left our house. He's now 21, and I see this concept of code switching coming out in him more than ever. Again, that leaving the house, being in college. Explain what code switching is and how you've seen it play out in your life.
Yeah. So code switching is when people basically switch their demeanor and oftentimes vocabulary. And it can show up in other ways, like how you dress too, I think. But I think most of the time we think about vernacular and we think about kind of attitude when you're in one setting versus another. And we commonly see this described as Black people, in a sense, acting Black with their Black friends and then acting white with their white friends. It can be depicted on social media as kind of like how you act at work versus how you act at home, which is another way to describe code switch, which might be relatable to a lot of people, right? You don't let your home life enter your work life. And so with people of color, code switching has often been a safety net. And so if there's a lot of slang or if there's accents, if there's, even just vocabulary, y'all, yo, right?
Mm-hmm.
I go from saying yo to everybody to saying hello, sir. That's a good sign of code switching, right? And so we've seen this commonly play out in communities of color who you might see them outside of work and it's almost like they're a different person.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this has really gotten popularized over the last couple of years, especially like through TV shows and media and now more kind of conversational things. And it happens a lot in transracial families. And for many transracial families, it is a very confusing time. Me and my mom actually did a whole podcast episode about her experience with me code switching and how it was actually offensive to her at first because she didn't understand why I would act differently with one community versus another. And so I think in transracial adoption, code switching is so easy for transracial adoptees who end up finding a community of color. Because once we're in those communities, like when I was living in Atlanta, I totally learned to be a different person. I totally had and even coming home for breaks, I would, in many ways, I would code switch a little bit, but I would still have parts of that with me. And so I think a lot of times transracial adoptees end up in communities that look like them, especially as young adults, and they find comfort, safety, understanding in that community, which allows them to relate to it more, embrace more parts of it. But then when they come home, they also still have those parts of them. And so they also naturally fit back into that mold as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so we find ourselves between those two worlds very easily. And when one side sees the other side, it tends to be like interesting or confusing. And so when transracial parents see the code switching or the switch back into maybe Black vernacular, slang, dress, comfort, and I think that's usually what's most offensive, or offensive might not be the right word, but most confusing to parents is actually the comfort that they see in the code switching. Is what they find to be the most confusing part of it. It does throw people into, I think, a discomfortable position because in a sense, you would hope that comfortability was what you raised them in, right?
Right.
And so it becomes, I think, another lesson for transracial parents around the importance of race and culture and how the racial experience that your children will inevitably have will push them to find areas where it's safe for them to feel like their full self. And so that is typically going to be in those communities, and they'll code switch back and forth. I'm not sure I'm answering the question because I might have gone on a little bit of a tangent there.
No, it's great.
But I will say that parents should not be offended by code switching because I think code switching is a little bit of an inevitable. I think all people in one sense or another code switch. And so I think people do tend to act differently around their culture versus their like culture of origin versus another culture because there are relatable factors within that. And those can also go down to cultural things. So it can happen within a race too, whereas like a country white person would have to code switch to a city white person.
Right.
And so, you know what I'm saying? And so there is also code switching within racial cultures. And so I would look at code switching as usually as an inevitable for your child. And it's also going to show up in various forms within people of the same race. And it's usually, if you're finding it in the transracial context, it is usually a good thing. It's usually a sign that your child is finding safety, finding comfort in their culture and their racial identity. And unless you feel like they are like a dramatically different person with these people versus you, it is usually just a sign that they found comfort and safety within people who understand their context and experience in life. And if they're like seemingly normal and not like a Debbie Downer to code switch into your family, that also usually means that they still find comfort in your family as well, which means that like when I go home, I don't like, I still bring a lot of my personality to it, but I know that I'm different than I am with my friends. And
Right.
that doesn't bother me at all because like I love my family. I enjoy my time with my family. There's no me code switching back and forth in that context is not for safety. It's just for the environment. And so that was a long-winded way of talking a lot about code switching. But I think there's two sides of it. There's like culture safety side of it, whereas like, from in the work context, you might code switch for safety, but in a personal context, it can just be about comfort and community.
I'm going to
Yeah,
kind of
I
ask you a
was.
question off the cuff. So kind of related to this. So we have a adult child who I wouldn't call it code switching necessarily because it's just completely has changed their vernacular. Their like
Yeah.
completely has adapted to the Black community, which on one sense, that's wonderful. We love to see that finding themselves and all that, but has really struggled because their grammar has gotten really poor. And again, like I think there's part of that of with the people she hangs around with, but then when she tries to get a job and she's really struggling making ends meet because she can't get a job. And like as a mom, I want to say, well, when you're having these interviews, let's try to use proper grammar. But then I feel like I shouldn't say anything because then am I saying that she's not smart? But she is. So like, would you say anything as a parent? Would you kind of coach towards that? Or you're like,
Yeah.
is that stepping on toes now because that's like what she has found as her identity?
Yeah. So I guess maybe what I would think about in this context, because I could see the conversation going badly, I would think about a broader lens of what it means to be their race. And I think this is usually sometimes a challenge, is that sometimes transracial adoptees like cling to, and I'm not saying this is your daughter's experience, but sometimes they cling to their first representation of it, and that becomes all they understand about it. And I would say that you probably have many other Black people in your community and in your life that do not talk that way and do not, are able to have ranges of dialect. And that it actually might be more helpful than anything to push her in that direction, to push her in the direction of still finding confidence in herself and seeing herself represented, but in a way that would push her in the career direction and in the life direction that, she should go on, that she should want to go on. And I think it can be really hard, transracial adoptees really often, if they have limited or if they feel like they have limited perspective on like how to relate to their racial identity. And so finding exposure, mentor communities where she can see like professional versions of herself is probably the better thing to do in this instance. And I'm not sure how old your child is because that also plays a difference too. But I'm assuming if she's trying to get a job, she's old enough to like not like that you said that.
Yeah.
I could see it could be better coming from somebody else. Like it could
Yeah,
just
for
be
sure.
better coming from somebody else. And sometimes like that's just the parent game in general, right? Aren't we like often playing that game in all areas? And
With all
so,
kids.
yeah, just like it's probably better if that from somebody else, but it might come a little bit more naturally if they're also like getting the depiction, understanding how they can both be this and that without it feeling like if I'm that, I'm white, and if I'm this, I'm Black, right?
Yes.
Which
Yeah.
might be how
Yep.
she's siloing it.
Right. Yep.
Well, and that's I wanted to add too, because to this of like you already alluded to this, Isaac, as well, but I think it's worth mentioning, especially for those of us who are white, coming from sort of the dominant culture, because there's a lot of stuff my wife and I have learned through the years on kind of our own blinders or not realizing to give us more compassion. But I think beyond just the transracial adoptees experience of code shifting, what's leading to that is, and you alluded to this, but is the identity that comes before that. There's an internal conflict that I think a lot of Black people would say already exists already for them, not just even into a new family where they're a different race. It's that idea that I'm already navigating a gap between my own racial identity and then having to conform to the bigger dominant culture's norms. So that's already there. I think a lot of our African American friends would say that in their own life. So then on top of that, to be adopted, another layer, right? And is that fair? Like that's another layer of that?
Yeah, I would say that's fair to say. Yeah, I mean, adoption brings so many layers, transracial adoption even more. And so I would say that's 100% correct, that how many layers do we expect young people to navigate well, and how many layers would we have navigated well as young people is maybe another question.
Yeah.
I think that's a really real transracial adoptee and adoptee struggle is there's layers of who am I, and those layers are hard to navigate through, and they're like teenage adoptees deserve so much more compassion and grace than we give them, even if they've grown up in great homes, because like it's just a hard transition. Like being a young adult adoptee, a late teenager is just like a really complex thing. And you are navigating so many things on top of the understanding that like as soon as you turn 18, like your whole birth world can find you. You can find your whole birth world. So like on top of all the other things that are happening, you also understand that on your 18th birthday, your whole life could change. And I know many adoptees that turned 18, 19, and they got messages, so they got things. And so, and adoptees think about that on their 18th birthday. They think about having access to information. And so that becomes another complicated part about being a young adult adoptee. And so, yeah, I agree with everything said. And I think we can all do better about compassion for young adoptees, even in trying to steer them in the right direction. And yeah,
Yeah.
life is a long road, and
Yeah.
want to set them up for the best success early on, but sometimes just they got to walk a different path. I had to walk a different path, and I'm sure there's many other adoptees who had to walk different paths and unique paths to really get to the place where they could feel like successful living young or adults in general. And yeah, sometimes I think we have to let go of our preconceived idea of like young adult success with adoptees and figure out what are the wins. And this is a TBRI thing, which I'm sure you guys are very familiar with, which is like the idea of like, what if my child doesn't act their age? And I think actually this goes into adulthood. It's not just your 10-year-old or your 12-year-old or your teenager. Like this is your 22-year-old who cannot process their emotions yet. And so it's just a real part of trauma. It's a real part of loss. And yeah, doing whatever we can to keep moving adoptees in the right direction with grace and love, I think matters.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do want to just quickly encourage people that might be listening who are adoptive parents or adoptees even who have just struggled and really unsure. We have 3 adult children who are Black, who are in our family. They were all adopted at older ages, 10, 12, and 15, so a little bit older. So I had experienced a lot of life, and all 3 of them, we went through seasons of them running away, leaving the family, not knowing where they were, some of them for months and months, getting into that adulthood and just pushing us completely out. But all 3 of them have come back around, and it was a healing journey they needed to experience, which sounds like very similar to you. And I'm sure that's very common. And just to love them, to just keep showing them love no matter what through all of that. And there's a good chance that they will eventually come around and come back to be like, I value family and the family that you have given me, even though you might have made mistakes. We've all made mistakes, but recognize that too. Because I think that's part of the healing journey, to say, hey, Dad and I, we know we've not got this perfectly. Like, we love you and we failed. We fail all of our kids, but we're always here, and it's just been fun to be able to see that on the flip side of them all coming back around. So
Absolutely. To me, those are the most heartwarming stories in adoption. I know we all like the perfect stories, but those to me are the like realistic, beautiful, heartwarming stories of like struggle, loss, and adoptees finding themselves, but also like feeling safe enough to always come home. And that's just such a beautiful gift I think adoptive parents can give adoptees. Probably the most beautiful gift adoptive parents can give adoptees is that feeling of unconditional love in the midst of however their grief might show up.
Yeah, we don't have much time to get into it, but I just want to mention what ghost kingdoms are because I do think it's
Oh
common
my
too
goodness.
for,
Yeah.
these kids to go through, like they're being raised in a transracial home and then they see somebody on TV or they see the mailman or they see a teacher who looks like them and they might be like, oh, I'm going to now envision that person to be my dad, or I'm going to make up the story in my mind where they play that they're their dad or imagine it. Did you experience that growing up, like seeing people that you thought maybe, or even just told yourself that's
Yeah.
dad or that's mom?
Yeah, for sure. Ghost kingdoms are really interesting. I was not as much of a ghost kingdomer as many other people. I certainly had ghost kingdoms, where I thought, my birth father might show up out of the nowhere. Like they're it's funny how many of them are around like money and around like fame and around like things like that. Birth father is like a famous athlete or like TV actor or like Prince somewhere, which were a lot of mine. And so I don't know. I'm sure somebody much smarter than me who spends a lot of time thinking about ghost kingdoms could tell us why that's the case. But I do find that to be an interesting part about ghost kingdoms, along with the fact that they can be like seeing somebody who is the mailman who looks like you. But yes, I did have ghost kingdoms. And ghost kingdoms, to me, are just a representation of curiosity unexpressed. And so I think that ghost kingdoms are not bad, but I also don't necessarily like find them to be like overly good. I think ghost kingdoms are a normal experience for adoptees, but if adoptees have ghost kingdoms for like their whole childhood into their teenage years, I would view that more as a sign of curiosity unexplored, which meant that enough conversations weren't happening about their birth parents, their birth story. And that might not always be the adoptive parent's fault, but I think a lot of adoptive parents can open up dialogues that help their child process their story. And I think what a lot of adoptees have done with their ghost kingdoms is found them as security to make sense of a story that they didn't understand.
Mm.
And I personally don't find that to be like a healthy or great way for adoptees to experience that. Though, again, I don't think that they're wrong. And I think every adoptee has a ghost kingdom of some sort throughout their time. But I would always suggest parents to be on the front end of trying to make sure their child could come to them with curiosity around who their birth parents are and their birth story, because I think ghost kingdoms are also not a necessary part of the adoption journey. That adoptees could grow up in homes where they didn't wonder whether the milkman was their birth father because they trust that if the milkman was their birth father, their parents would have told them.
Right.
Such a great point.
And so I think that, yeah, it's not a necessary part of adoption. And so can we promote open conversations? Can adoptees grow up in homes where their curiosity is encouraged and parents feel comfortable having these conversations? I think yes. And that's a lot of the work that we do. A lot of the work and guidance that we provide, resources we create, help parents open conversations up. And I think that's a more powerful thing for adoptees.
Love that so much. I mean, it's almost like the ghost kingdoms are maybe training wheels that just come off through coping and
Yeah.
growing and healing. So, and then
Yeah.
they're left behind.
There's been some great people like I know Angela Tucker talks about ghost kingdoms really well. I'm forgetting the other lady who wrote. There's a lady who wrote a book about ghost kingdoms, and if I find it, I'll send it to you guys. But there's a lot of great people who've done a lot of great stuff around ghost kingdoms. So again, not like knocking them, but just thinking of them as very like as like something that should be happening in the mind of like a 5-year-old, not a 15-year-old.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, as we kind of close this episode out, we like to finish with sort of a closing line sentence that you fill in. So the one for you today is, how would you finish the sentence? What youth who are adopted really need is?
Youth who are adopted really need is, I want to say unconditional love, but it feels too simplistic, if that makes sense. But like my overwhelming answer would be like unconditional love, maybe plus open conversations about adoption. And
That's
that could be a
great.
whole nother podcast.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yes.
Be continued.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Isaac, this has been a wonderful conversation. I know our listeners got a lot out of it. And just encouraged as well by hearing stories like yours. And you have a lot of great things to offer. So tell us a little bit about the tools, resources, book, where people can find you and follow you and all the good stuff.
Absolutely. So on Instagram, you can find me at Isaac_Etter, ISAAC_ETTER. If you're a parent, we send out free resources every week through our newsletter. It's www.parentingdifferent.com. It is an absolutely free resource. We make a bunch of content, we make resources, and we host multiple trainings every single month. And so join that newsletter to find out all of those things. And then the Instagram for that company is Parenting Different.
And the
Very
book you
cool.
wrote?
The book I called is called A Practical Guide, Transracial Adoption. If you join our newsletter, you'll find out it immediately. If you go to my Instagram, it's in my bio. It is on Amazon, but if you get it from my Instagram bio, it comes with a bunch of other free stuff, like trainings from me and my mom and like other resources we created. So would suggest there if it's something that you want.
Greg and Sam Holbach. They're proud parents of 2 Lakota daughters, ages 8 and 6, who were adopted through our I Belong project. So we want to dive into that a little bit more, dive into your adoption journey and also your girls being Lakota.
Yeah, when we started the process and the inquiry with AKB through the I Belong project, and then subsequently with the calls with the social services team, um, every step of the process from from review of our home study to eventual interview to placement of us with the kids to them, finally finalizing adoption. Every step of the process from start to finish included both the social services team and the tribal team. So one unique part of the process was that the tribal court worked with us and required that we had to had to really sit down and think about and write out a comprehensive cultural plan for the girls once they were placed with us. So we worked hard to explain, first of all, we worked hard to learn the culture, learn some of the language, learn some of the practices that we could incorporate into our own family and our home here. And we had to explain how we would work with the kids to learn about their tribe, learn about their language, keep in touch with the tribal roots. And as the final adoption court hearing was held, we can say with a warm heart, and it's been a big privilege of ours to have been selected by the tribe as parents for the kids. And yeah, it's just every step that you might have with the social services department, you have that same step with the tribe. So you have to do everything twice, which we didn't mind at all because it was a learning opportunity for us. But if there are families out there that are going through that process, just know that you have to do it twice.
So we have a daughter who we adopted through foster care, but she's originally from Ethiopia. And so we've gotten to know the Ethiopian culture and hair and food and, a lot of stuff that I just didn't know would come into our house. And I just love it. I love all aspects of it. So are there some new things that you guys have, events you've gone to or foods that you've tried that you're like, I would have never thought. And now it's just part of your daily life or your yearly life?
There's been a lot because the more we learn, the more interest that we have and we want to incorporate it and share it with the girls. And especially our oldest, she really loves to learn. I mean, she loves to learn anything, but when we're presenting any kind of tribal information, she just grasps onto it and she wants to use it and tell people about it. So one of the biggest ones was we incorporated a word of the week. And so we've been taking really common phrases like time to eat or let's go, good morning, good night, anything that a parent would say at least on a daily basis. And we've translated it into their language and we have it as a word of the week. And the girls are learning it as we're learning it. And we hang them on their bedroom door so that as time passes, it's kind of like a little flip card. They can look at it in English on one side and then they can see it in Lakota on the other side. And they look at those all the time. And sometimes they'll ask for specific words, like they wanted to learn the word for grandma and they wanted to learn the word for please. And so it's fun to hear them get excited about, hey, can you open the dictionary and look up this word?
Yeah.
And so we'll make a new card for it. Powwow has been another integration into our life. We actually didn't even know about the Indian Heritage Association that's here in basically our backyard. And so, once the girls were here and living with us, when we started trying to find ways to incorporate their culture locally, we found the Indian Heritage Association. And they hold powwows, I think 2 a year. So we contacted their social services team about getting customary regalia, and we were able to obtain that. And so now when we take them to powwow, they're wearing the jingle dresses, they have ribbon skirts. um, they will go out and do dance, because we'll watch YouTube videos about how to dance, and they practice here in the living room, and they really enjoy going to powwow, showing that off. And it really, you can see how special it is, especially to the oldest one. She'll just glow when she's out there dancing.
That's
That's
awesome.
wonderful.
Yeah, I'll add that incorporating that language piece to our life has been really a lot of fun for all of us, for all four of us. And I'll put my hand up here for a little edit if you need to. But
Uh-huh.
I'd like to really, really call out the great work that the Lakota Language Consortium has done, because they
Oh,
have an app featuring the Lakota Dictionary, which has been the best tool for us. So shout out to Lakota Language Consortium.
cool.
Then we also have a language game app called Owaksape, which is a kids game that they can learn kid phrases, and really helped us learn the language too. And I'll say that learning Lakota has been really useful for us in public settings, especially when you're trying to like shout across the playground to get their attention. It's easy for us to shout
Yeah.
"Wayatiwahe," which means "Let's go, family," and only our two kids will look
Yeah.
up and realize it's time to leave.
That's
And
like
we
great.
have several phrases like that that we'll shout out in public, or just know within the four of us. Or like when the kids at the end of school get an academic award, or they're both in gymnastics, so they'll be competing on the beam or on the floor or something, and dad wants to embarrass them, and I'll shout out "Waya Ohitika Akichita," which means "Waya, let's go, brave warrior." Just encouraging them through their own language. So it's been a lot of fun for all four of us to learn that. It's almost like I don't know, a secret family language that not a lot of people
Yeah,
know. But
I bet.
I'm gonna let Sam, if you would, tell the story about us at powwow with the girls talking in their.
Yeah, at the last powwow we went to, there was an older gentleman he's Lakota, and he was really excited. He recognized the jingle dresses that the girls were wearing, because there's like a patch on it. So he recognized that. So he came over and he talked to us, and he was really excited when our oldest introduced herself in Lakota. And so they started talking in Lakota, and she was sharing all the words and the phrases that she knows. And he actually got teary-eyed, and he was just overwhelmed to hear her speaking Lakota and knowing those phrases. And it was really heartwarming to see those two just chatting and what words they knew. And he was telling her a couple of new words, and it was really sweet.
It just makes me think of my kids. I have multiple kids from different cultures, and I've gotten many times from other people like, those kids don't belong in your family, or, comments like that. And my personal belief is kids belong first in their families if it's safe and viable, then within their extended family, then within their culture. And then if not, it doesn't always work out that way. And
Uh-huh.
for most of my adopted kids, that's been their story. And we try our best to teach them language, teach food, culture, traditions. And, we're not going to get it perfectly, but it sounds like you guys are doing a really good job of trying to show your girls that matters and that heritage is so important, and that you are investing in that and investing in that for them. So I appreciate that a lot. And I do just want to say that if you're listening, and if you are considering adopting, or you have adopted cross-culturally, it is so important. It's imperative to dive in and to really give your kids that aspect of who they are.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well
thank
said.
you. It's been a real privilege to learn the culture and share that with our kids, because we're doing, like you said, Courtney, we're trying to do our level best to keep them connected to their culture and make a difference for them.
What I love too is I think, this is a broader discussion even around just, the Native American heritage. I think we know historically the treatment of Native Americans, just through the years, and what that looked like with settling and expansion. And yet when I think of how little probably most Americans know, of Native American culture, of history, there's just very little overlap. And what I've learned and seen is just the dignity and the pride and the respect of the people to, I mean, even like the Navajo language won the Pacific in World War II. I mean, it's just, I love the code talker stuff. It's just, but even that wasn't recognized until, I mean, wasn't it like, I think Obama's term or something? I mean, how long that was after World War II. So even in all of this, there's this aspect too of just, Native American heritage that's really, yeah, it's new to all Americans. I mean, and you guys immersing in there. I was going to ask you overall, like your experience as white Americans kind of entering into those spaces. I mean, that had to feel intimidating early on, especially I would think of just like, where's my place here? How am I going to be received? I mean, talk a little bit about the reception and kind of what that was for you guys.
Definitely.
Sam and I, we had to work at it. We had to demonstrate to the tribe that we were learning the language. We learned about the different makeups of the reservation. We had to kind of prove ourselves that we could do this. And us learning the language and going to powwow was one of our, I don't want to say coming out party, but one of our our stepping out into the world as a family together with cross-cultural family. The first powwow we went to, no kidding, was a bit uncomfortable because, and you can use this, we're two white people taking natives to a powwow where there aren't a lot of white people. But sure enough, our daughters are showing up, full regalia, dancing around powwow just like everybody else was. And I think Sam and I were the only ones uncomfortable there. We just kind of took that upon ourselves, I guess. And then the second and third time we came around to powwow, folks, they embraced us more. They had more questions. They recognized the logos on our regalia, the horse and everything for the tribal logos, and it was way more welcoming. And that's probably more from us than it was the tribe at the powwow because we just didn't know what to expect. And then once we opened ourselves up to more conversations and talking in the language to other people around powwow, it became really commonplace now for us to interact with our Florida Indian Heritage partners. And we get together sometimes on the weekends with some folks that live up the road that are part of the tribe, and we just spend time together. I think to answer your question, Travis, it was probably more on us as being uncomfortable than it was the community putting pressure on us. It was us. It was Sam and Greg as parents trying to fill a gap.
I hope you enjoyed this webinar, Understanding Transracial Factors, with our guests, Isaac, Greg, and Sam. Again, I know you enjoyed the conversations from them. They have a lot to share. And want to remind you that we are in the middle of a series, so we have many of them already listed on our website, FosterCon.org. This was supposed to be the end of our series, and we've decided to give you guys a little holiday gift, a bonus of another webinar called Understanding Reunification. Taken from multiple podcast interviews that we've done, families who have been reunified, and just hearing their stories and how we can do that. Again, how we can come alongside those families really well as foster families. So I hope you're getting a lot out of these, and also know that a lot of you are probably here for your CE credits. I understand that as a foster mom. I understand that we need trainings. If you need training credit hours, I'll get to that in just a second. But I also want you to know that it does take a lot of time, a lot of resources for us to curate content like this. And we are a nonprofit. So if you are getting a lot out of these and you feel led to donate $5, $10, $20, $100, anything helps. So you can go to americaskidsbelong.org. You can choose donate, and we can continue to make great content like these webinars. And if you are here for that CE credit, there is a form at fostercon.org. I want to remind you, we often get people that fill out these forms and we have to respond to them because they don't quite follow instructions. So you have to fill out forms individually. You cannot fill it out for your spouse. You also cannot fill out the form together as a partner, spouse, couple. You need to fill out your own individually, and we have to, that's what we kind of agreed to agencies and counties, is that we will verify that people watch this. If you're just copying and pasting your answers to the next to your husbands or whatever, it just kind of shows us that they didn't really watch it. So we ask that you are honest, that you'll do it individually, and then we can get you that certificate. Most of our webinars are an hour and a half. Some of them are an hour. So you will want to note that. I think a lot of people just think they're an hour and a half, but a couple of them are not. They are only an hour, and it will note that on your certificate credit that you get. And then finally, I want you to know, if you don't know a lot about America's Kids Belong, we have many other programs. We have Fostering Friend Door. That is a place where you can go to get all your foster care questions answered. Questions about specific needs, questions about the journey, questions about licensure. If you have people that you know are considering foster care, it's a great first place to send them. Literally, probably not thousands, but hundreds of questions that we answer on there about foster care. We also have our Foster Friendly podcast. I have even used some of these podcast episodes as my CE credit. Our county is pretty great about that. If I just write them a little blurb about what I learned, I can get CE credit. So I'll listen to like 3 or 4 podcasts that are kind of related to each other, and then I'll turn it in for a couple hours of credit. And of course, FosterCon that you were a part of today. So again, thanks for joining us. We appreciate all the people watching, and also really love when you share this with other people. It gives us, we watch analytics a lot as a nonprofit. Our donors and our board, they always want to know that these things that were created are being used for a purpose. So when you share it with other people, it just really helps us, show our board and show our donors that these are things that are needed for foster families. So I encourage you to share it with a friend, share it with your county, share it with people that could use the credit or just the education around foster care. Have a great day.